On this week's episode, I'm turning this piece into a one-of-a-kind bar cabinet. It was originally part of a set designed to be stacked on top of each other, and the seller had both listed for $15. So my partner and I thought it would be fun to make a little competition out of it. He refinished one and I tackled the other one. We split the cost, so each piece ended up being just $7.50. Now, my partner isn't a fan of being on camera, but I'll show you his finished piece at the end. And you'll have to let us know which one you like better. Both of our pieces will be bar cabinets, and budget-wise, we're going to try to stay as close to $100 as possible. Alright, you might be wondering why a bar cabinet? Well, Lisa over at Ivy Lean Home invited me to join her bar cabinet collab. This means a group of talented YouTubers and I come together for a playlist on her channel to showcase our take on refinishing old cabinets or even just bar cabinets. Either way, the end results had to be a bar cabinet. Alright, I started by removing the hardware and the foldable doors because I just couldn't wait to strip those doors. I laid out a plastic sheet on my table and clamped down some painter's paper to keep the stripper contained, which also made cleanup easier. I didn't bother labeling the doors since it was simple to match them back up later by lining the hinges and screw holes. Now, this is what I mean when I say I couldn't wait to strip the doors. It wasn't just because of this chip right here. It was also because I could see the wood grain pattern peeking through the black paint and I had to see what was underneath. I used Clean Strip Premium Stripper for this project. You just need to shake it really well before applying, and I just used a bristle brush to spread it over the surface. The instructions say to wait about 15 minutes for it to work, but how long it really takes depends on how the paint reacts. Around the 5-minute mark, I noticed the stripper starting to dry out, so I added a bit more. As I spread it with my brush, I noticed that the paint was already lifting, so I grabbed my plastic putty knife and started scraping. And y'all, let me just tell you, I was so thrilled with what I found underneath. Let me just zoom you in so you can see for yourself. After stripping each door, I use warm water with a bit of Dawn dish soap to clean off any leftover stripper residue. Then I rinse everything with plain water. You could use Clean Strip After Wash instead, but I was working with a budget and honestly, water is free and does the job just fine. While I let the doors sit out and dry completely, I started stripping the frame. I repeated the same steps I used for the doors. I like working in sections because it helps me make the most of my time. While one section is drying, I can work on another, and I just keep alternating until everything is ready for the next step. Speaking of the next steps, I moved on to sanding the entire piece. I started with 120 grit sandpaper because I wasn't sure how thin the veneer was, and it seemed to be working quite well. You can see here where I sanded versus where I didn't, but it was taking forever, so I switched to 80 grit, which luckily sped things up a lot. For the larger flat sections, I used my orbital sander and worked my way up to 220 grit. And after that, I hand sanded the rest. For the rounded edges and crevices, I use a sanding sponge thingy thing, I guess that makes sense, but that will help me get into the tighter spots. For the smaller flat areas, like the edges, I switched to my Surf Prep sander. It's less aggressive than my orbital, and I feel like I have better control with it, especially for keeping it flat against the edges. And of course, I repeated the same steps for the frame. I realized I hadn't wiped this piece down yet, so I decided to at least clean the inside, especially since I plan to keep it black. However, I don't love how shiny the finish is, and I wanted to make sure the paint was properly adhered. So to prep it, I scuff sanded the entire interior using a worn out 120 grit sandpaper. And I sanded the delicate parts like the edges with my surf prep. Once the entire piece was fully sanded, I decided it was time to work on the base. And yes, don't judge my messy drawer. We're still organizing everything after moving into this space. But I knew all my templates, curvy rulers, and anything else I needed to draw out the design were in that drawer. Now, let me tell you, I had no clue what I was doing or where to even start. I thought I had an idea in mind, but I ended up making the base taller because I didn't like how it looked initially, and that's why this part is on a time lapse. I think I spent about 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, just trying to figure it out. But here's the inspiration picture I used for the base design. It's pretty intricate, but I absolutely fell in love with it when I saw it on Pinterest. With that said, there's no way in hell I'm spending $26,000 on a bar cabinet. No shade to the designer or the company. It's stunning and I'm sure it's worth every penny. But for me, knowing my skills and wanting to challenge myself, I just had to make my own version of it. After cutting the straight edge I needed on my table saw, I took the template to my bandsaw to cut out the actual design. This particular template was only meant for the front feet, but as I worked, I realized I couldn't get the two curved parts that meet the aprons to match perfectly. Because, well, I'm human. I'm not a CNC machine, so I can't make identical cuts every time. So to save time and avoid frustration, I decided to cut off the part I didn't really like and adjust the template's position as I went. But you know, there's a silver lining. I can now use this template for the back feet. Now, as for the overall height of this piece, I didn't have a specific measurement in mind. Initially, I thought the base would be about 12 inches tall, but it ended up being closer to 16 inches. Honestly, I was just figuring out as I went and decided to let the design come to me. After cutting out the template, I used the same worn out 120 grit sandpaper to soften and smooth all of the edges. Then I brought it over to the piece to figure out where I wanted the foot to be positioned. I knew I wanted the top apron to sit half of an inch away from the piece and for the front feet to extend slightly past the frame, but as close to it as possible. And of course, to plan this, I used a scrap piece of wood as a stand-in for the apron and drew a line half of an inch away from the piece. Once I decided which side of the foot I liked and where I wanted it positioned, I marked on the bottom of the piece how far in the foot would sit on each side. These marks helped me subtract the total width of the piece from each point, which gave me the exact length the apron needed to be. I hope this makes sense. But if not, I guess you'll just see how it all comes together. I just have one more template to make before cutting out my design. This one is for the top side aprons. I wanted the base to have a floating look, but I still needed key points where the base would attach to the frame. So to create that effect, I curved each end by half of an inch. I followed the same process I used for the foot template, cutting it down to size with my miter saw. And while I had the saw out, I also cut the foot template. Then I moved to my table saw to cut the height. Don't worry, I felt totally comfortable making that cut. There was enough clearance, even though that angle might have looked questionable. But once that was done, I took it to my bandsaw to cut out the curve design. Now that all my templates are complete, it is time to trace them onto my oak. I have an oak slab set aside for this piece, but I also wanted to make use of my scrap wood. I check all my scraps to see if any matched the slab's thickness of 1 1/8 inches thick. After measuring each one with my rule on my table, I found 2 scraps that would work for this project. With that sorted, I move on to cutting the oak slab to the measurements I needed. In the end, I had 10 pieces total. 2 front feet, 2 back feet, 2 front aprons, and 4 side aprons. So this is what I mentioned earlier about the foot template. I traced one side, then flipped it over to trace the other. I also decided to trace my top side aprons before making rough cuts on my bandsaw. By now, you probably know my process when it comes to building bases. But if you are new here, I just want to say hello, hi, I'm so glad you're here. If you would like to join the Collab family, then hit that subscribe button. And if you are enjoying this video so far, then let me know by hitting that like button below. My base building process is pretty repetitive, but it works. I start by making my templates and cutting them out. Then I trace them onto my wood, rough cut those pieces, and route them to their final dimensions. I don't stray too far from that routine. It's tried and true and works well for me. I ended up using the template just for tracing the front foot. After that, I found it easier to use the foot that I just cut out to trace the other front foot and the back feet. For the back feet, I didn't want them to extend past the frame like the front feet do. So when tracing, I positioned the piece so it would stop right before the curve that would extend past the piece. Here's a reminder of where we started and where we are now. Can you see my vision? Next, I brought the template back to start rounding the final dimensions. To keep everything in place, I used double-sided tape to attach the pieces together. I started with one side of the foot using the template, then removed it and repeated the same process on the other side. I basically just flipped the template the same way I did when tracing. That double-sided tape came in handy for securing the wood to the table since the clamps weren't working. It did take a little effort to separate the tape from the table, but thankfully the table has a finished surface, so I wasn't too worried about damage. Finally, I drilled dowel holes on each end. I made the aprons 1.5 inches wide, which for me is the minimum width to comfortably drill 2 dowel holes into the wood. As you can see here, I've lined up the label to the dowels to ensure everything matches up correctly during assembly. Labeling is key here. Mixing up the ends and mismatch holes can be a big headache. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, I drilled pocket holes on one of the ends of the 4 side aprons to connect to the front ones. You'll see why in just a bit. Alright y'all, it's finally time to assemble the base. It gets dark super early in the winter, so I ran out of sunlight. So excuse the lighting, but I think you can see what I'm doing with the light that I had. But basically, I matched up the ends that go together and added glue. And y'all, I just realized I forgot to add more glue to the dowels sticking out. Ideally, you would want to do that. I did remember for the rest of the pieces, but I was more focused on filming here than gluing. Luckily, I had enough glue overall, so I'm not too worried about it. But I clamped everything together and let it sit overnight before unclamping the next day. Well, most of it. One of the pieces didn't fit because, well, silly me, I left one of the dowels too long. Look, I ran out of dowel pins to join all of the pieces, but I had a rod that was the right thickness, so I just cut it down to make some homemade dowel pins. It was an easy fix though because I just used my bandsaw to cut off the excess. Afterwards, I glued and clamped everything, then let it sit. While that was setting, I worked on the back pieces that hold the back feet. I wanted the feet to have a slight curve, so I sketched out a design and cut it with my bandsaw. Then I started marking a few different measurements on the oak to figure out where I wanted the side aprons to connect to the base. After some trial and error, I settled on positioning them about 5.5 inches in on each side. Once I had that sorted, I gave everything a thorough sanding with 80 grit sandpaper, paying extra attention to the curve areas to make sure they were smooth before routing. I wanted the edges to have a slight rounded look, so I used a 1/4 inch round over bit. I was careful to avoid areas where the side aprons would connect, so those spots would stay completely flush and seamless. Later on, I'll explain how I handled those sections. Alright, now that we're done with that, I moved on to assembling the base. I added glue for extra security, then clamped each side apron in place to keep everything steady. After letting the glue set for a bit, I drilled in pocket hole screws and added wood plugs to cover the holes for a clean, seamless finish. The next day, I placed my base on the piece to check my measurements. Alright, technically it fit, but I realized I miscalculated the front of the base, so the corners of the frame were touching the curved parts, which kept the base from sitting properly. At this point, I was having a little mini panic attack and wasn't thinking clearly as I rushed to find a solution. My first idea was to sketch out a quick adjustment and cut it out, but I couldn't find my jigsaw, and in desperation, I tried using my bandsaw for this big, awkward piece, which obviously didn't work out. But after taking a moment to regroup, I realized the best and safest solution was to make a new template and route it out. So, using an offcut from my original foot template, I sketched a slightly wider design and cut it out. I placed it on the base and, of course, used my flush trim bits to route the new shape. It's not ideal to route such a large piece, but sometimes you just have to make it work. I took my time and carefully routed until the bit reached the template. I tested out the base again, and luckily this time it worked out great. Just look at that. You can actually see the proper spacing and the base now sits perfectly. Afterward, I rounded over the new sections I shaped, and of course, just my luck, my bit was set too low and left a step in the wood. But it's fine. It's fine. I just sanded it completely smooth. I used my surf prep with 80 grit and the sponge attachment to smooth out the rounded edges. But this is what I was talking about earlier. I rounded over the areas where the side aprons meet the front apron using my surf prep. I also sanded down all of the flat sections and wood plugs with 80 grit before working my way up to 120 grit with my orbital. Now, some of you might think I'm a little crazy for what I'm about to do, but hear me out. I marked 1/2 inch down from the top of the foot because I want the area to look like separate pieces. To make this happen, I used my cheap multi-tool that I picked up from Harbor Freight a while back to carve a small divot all the way around the top. My goal is to add a fake custom brass detail to that section. I'm actually recording this voiceover before seeing the final result. So, fingers crossed that it turns out how I'm envisioning it. I guess you and I will find out together. But to get the smoothest finish possible, I'm filling the wood grain with wood filler. But just in case this plan doesn't work out, I do have a plan B, which is I'll just chop off that section entirely. Next, I turned my focus back to the project itself because I'm trying to get everything ready to stain and paint at the same time. To do that, we needed to break down some plywood. Normally, I'm not the one handling that. It's more my partner's thing. But he wanted to show me how simple it can be, and I needed some footage anyways. So, with his guidance, I ripped down the plywood. He also had the cutlass handy, so he walked me through the measurements that I needed as I went. We needed the plywood because we both needed new tops since there weren't any, and we also wanted to add wine holders inside our cabinets. Speaking of wine holders, my partner took care of cutting the dados where the shelves will go. Even though this is a competition, we're both rooting for each other to succeed. Plus, with the deadline, we don't mind helping each other out. But unfortunately, that means I don't have footage of the dados being cut, but I'll show you some clips of me assembling it instead. I started by edge banding each shelf side that will be visible. Then I glued and pocket holed the two end pieces. And where I pocket hold, none of that will be visible since it will be going up against the piece. But after that, I inserted the shelves with a bit of glue and secured it with brad nails. Once I had that put together, I moved on to attaching the new top. I had already cut the piece while breaking down the plywood, so all I needed to do was position the piece on top and shift it around until it was even on all sides. I decided to keep the back flush, but I let the front and the sides hang over by about 1/2 inch for a more finished look. The cabinet I'm working with is the bottom section of the stackable set, so it already had 6 pre-drilled holes from when the pieces were screwed together. That made my life a little easier. I just reused those holes to secure the top. I drilled pilot holes in each spot, followed by the screws, and it was good to go. Next, I started cutting my walnut veneer to size. Funny enough, I ordered this veneer before I even confirmed that the wood was walnut. I just guessed. To be honest, I'm still not 100% sure if the original veneer is walnut or another species in the walnut family, so let me know what you think in the comments. There are a few ways to attach veneer. You can use peel and stick veneer, which is pricier, or contact cement. I went the traditional route with wood glue. I made sure my surface was evenly coated with glue before laying the veneer down, leaving a slight overhang on all sides. Then I used my iron to adhere it, working carefully to ensure everything was smooth and secure. I'm just giving you a quick overview here, but there are plenty detailed YouTube tutorials that explain this process step by step. Once the veneer was in place, I trimmed off the excess with a box knife, followed by a profile scraper to smooth the edges, and then hand sanding to finish it off. For the edges running against the grain, I used my router with a flesh trim bit since I felt like the scraper might damage the wood. This is what the edge looked like after I routed and hand sanded it. But I wanted to let you know that the scraper worked great for the areas going with the grain though. And of course I repeated the same steps for the edges. The next day, I started staining and painting all the pieces. The reason why I'm staining the veneer is that the new walnut veneer doesn't quite match the tone of the original veneer on this piece. So I went through the stains that I had on hand and decided to lean into the warmth of this piece, choosing Honey Cork by Midwax. I applied one coat across the entire piece, but the walnut veneer on the top absorbed a little bit more yellow than expected. Okay, the lighting in this clip makes the yellow tones look stronger than they were in person. But to balance it out, I later added a coat of golden brown, which helped neutralize the yellow. I don't have toners, so I knew the veneers wouldn't match perfectly and was okay with them being slightly different as long as they stayed within the same tone. Luckily, the doors have a lot of natural color variation due to the cut of the veneer, and I felt that would help tie the whole piece together. Once the frame was dry, I covered it to prime and paint the interior. I sprayed the wine holder separately so I could hit all sides before attaching it. I didn't bother spraying the bottom back section as it would be hidden by the wine holder. But while waiting between coats, I worked on the doors. They're actually MDF with veneer on top, but the edges were exposed, so I sealed them with clear shellac. Thankfully, the edges were already close in tone to the rest of the piece, so they didn't need much color matching. In this clip, I'm removing the tape and sanding the edges with 220 grit sandpaper. Some shellac seeped under the tape and onto the veneer, but it sanded out easily. After that, I applied 2 coats of honey cork to all the doors. While I still had my paint booth set up, I started applying India ink to the base. If you're interested about the detailed steps I follow when using India ink, I have a short video that explains everything, which I'll just pop up on the screen if you want to check it out. A little goes a long way with this stuff. I have a 32-ounce bottle and have already used it on 2 pieces, plus this base, and I have plenty left for future projects. Alright y'all, we're at the point where it's either make it or break it with the divots I notch into the base. Either I'd regret it or it will turn out better than I expected. Off camera, I sprayed the base with clear shellac primer before applying rub and buff with a small brush. I spread it as evenly as possible, letting it dry for about 15 minutes before going back with a shop towel to wipe off any excess. Then I followed up with liquid leaf paint to create a more metallic brass finish. So using the same brush, I applied the paint, and toward the end, I made sure to create even strokes across the top to mimic the look of brushed brass. But that's not the only brass feature for this piece. I also purchased a thin hollow brass rod from Amazon at a great price. I plan to place it in the 1/2 inch gap between the base and the frame, which meant cutting the rod to size. For this, I used a brass tube cutter, which is super simple to use. To measure, I marked 1/2 inch down on the rod using my rule. Since the rod isn't solid, I inserted a wooden dowel close to the same size to keep it from bending while I worked. I lined up the blade of the cutter with my mark, tightened it just enough to snug it in place, and then twisted the rod all the way around. After each full rotation, I tightened the cutter a bit more and repeated the process until it cut through. I've seen others move the cutter itself, but I found I had better control by twisting the rod instead. After cutting each piece to size, I used the deburring reamer, or at least I think that's what it's called. It's basically a super handy tool for removing burrs after cutting. Once I had the brass cut to size, I used my Forstner bit to drill about 1/8 inch into the base. After that, I checked to make sure my dowel fit properly. The area I drilled into was where the front apron meets the back apron. My goal was to have the brass cover block the view of the side apron touching the piece, making it look like the frame is sitting directly on the brass. Next, I used my chop saw to cut the dowel to size. I made them 3/4 inch long since the gap is 1/2 inch, and I'm only drilling 1/8 inch into both the base and the frame. The easiest way to line this up is to insert the dowels into the base, place the base onto the frame, and trace where the dowels sit. Then remove the base and drill into the frame where you traced. Once I confirmed everything lined up, I added glue to the holes in the base to secure the dowels. For extra security, you could also screw them in from the bottom. After that, I brought the base back to the frame and placed the brass covers over the dowels before pushing it into place. Unfortunately, my camera stopped filming here, so you won't see me screwing the base in, but I did add screws to this area right here to secure it. On the very last day of working on this project, I sprayed polyacrylic to seal the entire piece. Once that dried, I added the new hardware. Okay, so here's a quick reminder of what it looked like before, and this is the final results. Honestly, I was a little stressed about finishing in time, but I wrapped it up literally the day before I needed to post the video. The lighting isn't the best here, but I'll take better clips when the sun's out and share them on Instagram or in the community section here on YouTube. I would love to hear your thoughts on this transformation, so let me know in the comments what you think. You could love it, you could hate it, just keep it kind, okay? But let's talk numbers. Okay, purchase price $7.50. Stripper $19.53. Tubing cutter $14.11. Brass tube $10.85. Pulls $8.68. Walnut veneer, well, I only used about 1/4 of the sheet. The rest is for another project, and I had a gift card, so technically this cost me nothing, but the full price was $41.48. Clear shellac, $12.24, making that total to be $114.39. I already had most of the other materials on hand, like the plywood, India ink, top coat, etc. But if we estimate about $50 for those, the grand total comes to $164.39. I haven't posted this piece for sale yet, but I would love to hear your thoughts. How much do you think I should list this for? And don't worry, I didn't forget about the competition with my partner. Here's a side-by-side comparison of both cabinets completely finished. They're totally different styles, and honestly, I can't decide which one one I like better. This just goes to show how little imagination can transform an ordinary piece into something amazing. Speaking of amazing, you should check out my friends' videos on their bar cabinet transformations. I promise you, you won't be disappointed. Alright, y'all, you know the drill. Stay tuned for the next one.